Hey guys, how's it going? So I want to start a new deep dive series here on my channel, and this is going to be primarily aimed at Beatle fans. Although if you're not a Beatle fan, maybe you're just a fan of 60s music or you love my channel, whatever the case may be, welcome. Happy to see you. But I want to talk about the Capitol American albums. We've never gotten reissues, the Capitol American albums, except on CD. And I'm really hoping one day that we do. A box set would be nice. They sold them individually. I'm all on board with that. But the Capitol albums are unique in many respects. Number one, they, for the most part, do not conform to the UK track listing or even the titles of the UK albums. It wasn't until you got to Help where you started to see a little bit of similarities there, but even Help, the UK version is a complete album, and the US version is essentially the soundtrack to the album. You've got the 7 songs that were in the movie, and then you've got some instrumental stuff on the way. But for the most part, those early years, 1964, 1965, you had entirely different albums in the UK and the US. And the first album that the American buying public was introduced to or was available to record buyers over here in the United States was an album called Introducing the Beatles. And this was released in the fall of 1963. And not for the first time, this cover image is actually flipped. If you hold this up to a mirror, that's what the original photograph looked like. Apparently, they felt it looked better as a mirror image, but nonetheless, and if you're wondering, the other one is Yesterday and Today. The Yesterday and Today, the trunk cover is actually flipped, but that's just a bit of useless trivia. But anyway, Introducing the Beatles, and this was essentially the Please Please Me album, which was, of course, the Beatles' first album in the United Kingdom, their first album ever. Track listing is a little different, but for the most part, what you have here are 12 of the 14 songs that were on the Please Please Me album. This album sunk without a trace. British rock and roll music really did not have any impact over in the States. And the story goes that's why it took the Beatles so long to come over to America, because they knew Americans just were not into British music. And it wasn't until I Want to Hold Your Hand hit the airwaves in January of 1964, and everybody went crazy with Beatlemania, that British music finally took a foothold over in the States, and then you had the British invasion, and the rest is history. So let's talk a bit about Meet the Beatles, which was the first popular Beatle album released in America, the first Capitol Beatle album. Capitol, of course, was a subsidiary of EMI, which also owned Parlophone Records, which issued all of the Beatles' music over in the UK. And so the Mother album, I call it the Mother album because this is basically where most of the material for Meet the Beatles was drawn from, is the album called With the Beatles. With the Beatles was released November 22nd, 1963. So while people in the UK were buying up the Beatle album, John F. Kennedy was getting assassinated in Dallas. But nonetheless, this was the second UK album. I believe it went to number 1. Beatlemania had already taken hold in the UK. Everybody there was enthralled with the Beatles. And the first single that, hit number 1 in the United States was I Want to Hold Your Hand. That was kind of the catalyst for the Beatles breaking through into the US. But on With the Beatles, the tracks that ended up on Meet the Beatles are It Won't Be Long, All I've Got to Do, and All My Loving. Those are the first 3 tracks on With the Beatles, which of course are sequenced a little lower on side 1. You've got Don't Bother Me, which starts off side 2. Little Child, Till There Was You. So almost the first side, all the songs on side 1 ended up on Meet the Beatles. The only exception being Please Mr. Postman. Then on side 2, you've got Hold Me Tight, I Want to Be Your Man, and Not a Second Time. The rest of those songs ended up on the Beatles' second album, which technically was the Beatles' third album in the United States, but the second album for Capitol. So when Capitol titles an album, Beatles' second album, Something New, the early Beatles, that's in reference to the Capitol catalog. Wasn't something new for the people over in the UK. It wasn't, new material necessarily by the time we got it over here in the United States. But anyway, it was a Capitol thing, and they got to dictate how those albums looked, what songs were on each album, how they were sequenced, etc. So first, I will go through the copies of Meet the Beatles that I have. This is a mono copy on the Rainbow label. This is a stereo copy, which is also on the Rainbow label. This is another stereo copy on the Rainbow label. I'm not sure. This one is a little bit of a later pressing because you've got this little icon here that says Gold Record Award. So I know it's a bit of a later pressing. This is a purple, which means late 1970s Capitol. And also, one of the differences is that you can usually tell the early pressings from the later ones because the Beatles font is in like a darker, almost like a dark gold. And on later pressings, it's much more like a burnt orange color. But anyway, just if you're out shopping and wondering what period of time your album comes from, that's in general one clue. This is a early 80s pressing, and it's on the Rainbow label, and sometimes it's easy to get confused because Capitol resurrected the Rainbow label in the early 80s on their Beatle albums. So some people might see this and think they have original copy, but it's not. And the clue again is the burnt orange font here, and then also the fact that you've got the gold award little sticker right there. So nonetheless, those are my vinyl copies. I've got a copy on cassette here, which dates from the 70s. And I've got the only two copies that are commercially released on CD. This version was released as part of the Capitol Albums Volume 1 box set. You've got the stereo version first, and then the mono version. And the actual CD itself replicates the label from the vinyl record, which is pretty cool. And then the version that was on the US Albums box set is like this. It's a little bit bigger just to give you kind of a size comparison. And this also has stereo and mono. Now the difference, these are the original Capitol mixes on the version that was released as part of the Capitol Albums Volume 1, whereas the versions on here are the original, remastered, I won't say original, but the remastered versions from 2009. They just lifted the mixes and put them on this record. So anyway, if you really enjoy the original Capitol mixes, which tend to have a little bit more reverb, you may want to seek out the Capitol Albums Volume 1. So anyway, what about the album itself? So like I said, you've got a number of tracks which were on with the Beatles. And I got to imagine walking into a record store and seeing this record, very kind of unusual for a pop music record. If you look at some of the early Beach Boys, which were also released on Capitol, some of the early Beach Boys albums, like Surfin' USA, Surfer Girl, Little Deuce Coupe, Shut Down Volume 2. Lots of bright colors, lots of smiling images of the band on the cover. And here you've got a photograph. This photograph was taken by Robert Freeman, who was a photographer. Now, of course, on the With the Beatles album, it was just simply black and white. And then Capitol's art department decided to give it a little bit more color. They would give it a blue tint. But Robert Freeman was a photographer. He took the photographs for With the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help, and Rubber Soul. He submitted an album design for Revolver, but the Beatles rejected it. But anyway, I don't want to get into outside of Meet the Beatles, but that's who the photographer was Robert Freeman. And then you've got that iconic picture of the Beatles on the back, which was taken by Dezo Hoffman. Dezo Hoffman, whenever you see a photograph of the Beatles in the collarless jacket, like a promotional photo of the Beatles in these collarless jackets, that was taken by a photographer, Dezo Hoffman, and he photographed the Beatles from 1963 to 1965, did a lot of promotional photographs for them. But nonetheless, I love the liner notes on here because they're just so 60s. All those great 60s albums had liner notes on them, and I love just kind of reading about, you'd have to be a hermit to have been unaware of the Beatles, and gives a little bit of a bio on the Beatles. So it's really a cool package, and I love, you read about them in Time, Newsweek, the New York Times. Here's the big beat sound of that fantastic, phenomenal foursome, Meet the Beatles. So Capitol, because I Want to Hold Your Hand was such a huge hit, that was going to be the first song that they placed on the album. Now, if you ask me, what's a better album? Do you prefer Meet the Beatles to With the Beatles? Meet the Beatles all day long. One of my issues with the Beatles, it's got too many cover songs on it. You've got Roll Over Beethoven, Till There Was You, Please Mr. Postman, You Really Got a Hold on Me, Money, Devil in Her Heart, just too many covers. And what Capitol was wise to do is they took those cover songs and they split them. Half of them ended up on Meet the Beatles, half of them ended up on Capitol's follow-up album, Beatles' second album. And what Capitol also did in its wisdom is it included the single. Now in the UK, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the B-side was This Boy. In America, the B-side was I Saw Her Standing There. So the first two tracks you get on Meet the Beatles are I Want to Hold Your Hand and I Saw Her Standing There. The third track is This Boy. So basically, you get both versions of the single of I Want to Hold Your Hand, both B-sides, and the first three tracks here to start off with. And then you get where With the Beatles begins with It Won't Be Long, All I've Got to Do, and All My Loving. And actually, I Want to Hold Your Hand, great idea for an album opener. Pretty similar to It Won't Be Long in terms of the tempo. Very much an up-tempo track, but it seems like they're pretty similar. If you listen to them side by side, I can understand how, It Won't Be Long was chosen as the lead-off track on With the Beatles because it's a great album opener. But I feel like it fits really well here as number 4, kind of a way to pick things up after the ballad of This Boy. Interesting, myself, like many people over in America, I didn't realize there was such a thing as With the Beatles. I bought into the hype, and I thought this was the Beatles' very first album. And so when I found out I Saw Her Standing There was from the previous album from 1963, I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. So Saw Her Standing There was, again, the lead-off track on Please Please Me. So you've got a couple of lead-off tracks here. I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Saw Her Standing There. It Won't Be Long, already on side 1. This Boy, I think, belonged on an album. It's got great harmonies. Yes, it's a ballad. Great vocal by John. But I'm so happy that it found a home on this record rather than being tucked away on a UK B-side. All I've Got to Do is a melancholy John song. I think it works better than anything that he'd written on Please Please Me. All My Loving, of course, was the first song that they played on the Ed Sullivan Show. That is a great track. Every song on here is just For me, anyway, it's solid gold, and it's such an album of its time, 1964. You've got that innocence of the lyrics. All they're singing about is love. They're not singing about, politics or topics or drugs or, some of the material that they would cover on their later albums. Side 2 starts off with Don't Bother Me, which again is a great side 2 opener. I don't know, the next time I think George Harrison would get a side 2 opening song was probably Here Comes the Sun. Then you've got Little Child, which is a great piano-based rocker with a harmonica. Till There Was You, which was taken from the soundtrack to The Music Man. The Beatles had been doing that in their repertoire since the Cavern days. Hold Me Tight is a great up-tempo Paul track, sort of the nearest he got to replicating I Saw Her Standing There. I Want to Be Your Man was a song that the Beatles gave to the Rolling Stones and recorded themselves. I happen to prefer the Rolling Stones version. I just do. But I Want to Be Your Man is a great Ringo track. And then Not a Second Time is a great way to close the album. It, where was it sequenced on this one? Not a Second Time was the second to last song on here. Money was the final track. So, yeah, all in all, a solid album. A great way to represent the Beatles. You've got the ballads. You've got the harder rocking. You've got the up-tempo. You've got a couple of covers thrown in for good measure. But just a solid album. I give it a 10 out of 10. I don't think there's a weak track on here. My least favorite would probably be either Not a Second Time or Little Child, but I still love those songs. But anyway, great way to introduce the U.S. To the Beatles, and one of my favorite Beatle albums. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of the series. Should I do more? Did I blow it here? Should I just stop while I'm ahead? Whatever you think. Anyway, hope you're having a great day, and take care.